In 1973, at the absolute peak of Hollywood masculinity, Clint Eastwood did something no one expected. Something that quietly shook the industry long before the public ever heard a word about it. He challenged Chuck Norris to a real fight. No cameras. No choreography. No stunt doubles. No scripts to hide behind. At the time, Clint Eastwood was the embodiment of cinematic toughness. His squinting stare, slow walk, and effortless authority had turned him into a living symbol of American grit. Directors built entire films around his silence. Producers trusted that audiences believed him without question. When Clint played tough, the world accepted it as truth. But that afternoon, truth was about to be tested. Studio executives laughed when they first heard whispers of the challenge. To them, it sounded like harmless posturing. Two action stars flexing egos in a town built on illusion. Actors leaned closer in private conversations, lowering their voices, unsure whether the story was a joke or something dangerously real. Martial artists, however, didn't laugh at all. They froze. Because Chuck Norris wasn't Hollywood tough. He was real-world dangerous. This wasn't a man who learned his moves from choreographers. Chuck Norris was a 6-time world karate champion, undefeated in professional competition. His hands weren't trained for camera angles. They were trained for speed, accuracy, and damage. He had spent years fighting men who didn't miss, didn't hesitate, and didn't forgive mistakes. And Clint Eastwood knew that. That's what made the challenge so unsettling. This wasn't about ego alone. It wasn't about publicity. And it certainly wasn't about winning. It was about something far deeper, a question Hollywood rarely dared to ask out loud. Where does image end, and reality begin? Behind the polished smiles and tailored suits of 1970s Hollywood, masculinity was currency. Being perceived as strong mattered just as much as actually being strong. Clint Eastwood had built an empire on that perception, but now, standing across from a man whose strength required no performance, the line blurred. No contracts were signed. No witnesses were invited. No one planned to talk about it afterward. Yet word spread anyway, because when two legends collide, even in silence, the impact travels. What happened next didn't explode into scandal. It didn't destroy reputations. It didn't end careers. Instead, it quietly redefined respect in Hollywood forever. It happened behind the scenes, during a high-profile studio gathering in Los Angeles. One of those invitation-only events where deals were whispered, reputations were measured in glances, and every handshake carried weight. The room was filled with producers in tailored suits, directors holding drinks they barely touched, and actors carefully performing versions of themselves even when the cameras were gone. At the center of it all stood Clint Eastwood. By 1973, Clint was more than a movie star. He was a presence. His cold stare had become iconic, his quiet authority unmistakable. People made space when he walked through a room. Conversations lowered in volume when he passed. He didn't need to raise his voice to command attention. The silence around him did it for him. Nearby, a different kind of attention followed a quieter figure. Chuck Norris had only recently arrived in Hollywood. He didn't announce himself. He didn't dominate conversations. He stood respectfully to the side, listening more than speaking, dressed simply, posture straight, eyes alert. There was no ego in his movements, no hunger for approval. Just discipline, the kind earned through years of real combat, not applause. To most of the room, Chuck was still an unknown. To the few who recognized him, he was something else entirely. A martial artist. A champion. A man whose reputation didn't need promotion. As the evening unfolded, laughter grew louder, drinks were refilled, and egos loosened. That's when someone, trying to be clever, trying to entertain, made the comment that changed the energy in the room. "Clint plays tough," the man said with a grin, gesturing toward Eastwood, "but Chuck is tough." The words hung in the air longer than expected. A ripple of laughter followed, polite, nervous, unsure. Some people glanced at Clint, expecting him to laugh it off. Others looked at Chuck, curious to see how he'd react. Most didn't realize they had just crossed an invisible line. Clint didn't laugh. He slowly turned his head, his expression unreadable, his gaze locking onto Chuck Norris. The room seemed to contract. Conversations died mid-sentence. Glasses paused halfway to lips. Even the music felt suddenly too loud. Clint studied Chuck for a moment, not with hostility, but with something closer to assessment. Then he spoke, his voice calm, controlled, unmistakably serious. "So, you really think you could take me in a real fight?" Silence swallowed the room. This wasn't playful banter. This wasn't Hollywood bravado. This was a question no one expected to hear, and no one wanted to answer. "Before we go any further, backhand index pointing right, comment below where you're watching from. Thumbs up like this video if you respect old school legends. Bell subscribe for more untold Hollywood stories." Chuck Norris didn't smile. He didn't shift his stance. He didn't glance around for approval. He met Clint's gaze calmly, the way a seasoned fighter meets uncertainty, without fear, without excitement. "I don't fight friends," he replied. The simplicity of the answer caught everyone off guard. There was no challenge in it. No insult. No attempt to dominate the moment. Yet somehow, it landed heavier than any boast ever could. Clint didn't respond right away. Instead, a faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Not amusement, but intrigue. The question hadn't been answered the way he expected, and that only made the mystery deeper. Because for the first time in a room full of powerful people, Clint Eastwood wasn't looking at an actor. He was looking at something real. And that realization sparked a curiosity that wouldn't let go. The challenge was never announced. There were no headlines, no leaked studio memos, no reporters chasing a story that didn't officially exist. In a town obsessed with publicity, this remained strangely private, almost sacred. No contracts. No press. Just two men, one training gym, and a quiet understanding that whatever happened would stay between them. The gym wasn't glamorous. No Hollywood mirrors. No spectators. Just worn mats, heavy bags, and the faint smell of sweat and discipline. It was the kind of place where reputations didn't matter, only ability did. Clint Eastwood arrived first. He didn't come in like a movie star. No entourage. No bravado. He stretched slowly, methodically, the way a man does when he knows something serious is coming. Clint wasn't reckless. Not now, not ever. His toughness had always been built on control. Over the years, he had trained in boxing, strength conditioning, and basic combat discipline. He understood timing, distance, and pain. He knew how to take a hit, and more importantly, how not to panic when one landed. But even Clint knew the difference. Boxing teaches endurance. Strength builds presence. Discipline creates confidence. Chuck Norris was something else entirely. By 1973, Chuck wasn't just trained, he was forged. A six-time world karate champion. Undefeated in professional competition. His body moved the way a weapon moves, efficient, precise, economical. He didn't waste energy. He didn't show off. Every motion had purpose, shaped by years of fighting opponents who didn't miss and didn't forgive mistakes. He arrived quietly, nodded in acknowledgement, and began warming up without a word. No tension. No performance. That calm unsettled Clint more than trash talk ever could. Friends had tried to stop this before it ever reached the gym. "Clint, don't do this," one warned. "He's not an actor pretending. He's not a stuntman. He's the real thing." Others tried appealing to ego. "You've already proven yourself. There's nothing to gain." But Clint wasn't chasing gain. He was chasing clarity. For years, he had carried the weight of an image, the toughest man in the room, the silent force, the one no one questioned. But somewhere beneath the persona, a question had formed, quiet but persistent. Was toughness something you played? Or something you were? Clint believed something deeper than technique or titles. He believed toughness was mindset, the ability to stay calm under pressure, to face fear without flinching, to stand your ground when the outcome was uncertain. He wasn't trying to dominate Chuck Norris. He was trying to measure himself against truth. Chuck, meanwhile, had no interest in measuring anything. To him, this wasn't about pride. It wasn't about proving superiority. Fighting had always been a responsibility, not a thrill. He had learned early that real strength carried consequences. The best fighters weren't the ones who sought confrontation, they were the ones who knew when to stop. That's why, before anything began, they agreed on one rule. No winner. No loser. Just truth. No knockouts. No injuries. No humiliation. Just an honest exchange, stripped of image, reputation, and expectation. They stood across from each other, the space between them charged but controlled. Clint adjusted his stance, grounding himself. Chuck observed, not staring, not judging, simply reading. Breathing slowed. Time stretched. In that moment, Hollywood didn't matter. Fame didn't matter. What they had accomplished on screen meant nothing here. This was a room where reality spoke louder than legacy. Both men understood something unspoken. Once this began, there would be no pretending. And whatever truth revealed itself, about strength, about limits, about respect, would stay with them long after they left that gym. The tension wasn't explosive. It was focused. And when the first move finally came, it would change how both men understood power forever. Inside the quiet gym, the doors were locked. No audience. No cameras. No studio executives waiting for gossip. Just the faint hum of overhead lights and the soft creak of the floor beneath two men who understood exactly what was at stake. The air felt heavier now, thick with unspoken awareness. This wasn't a rehearsal. There were no second takes here. They began to circle each other. Clint Eastwood moved with intention, shoulders relaxed, eyes steady. His stance wasn't flashy, but it was confident, the posture of someone who had spent a lifetime refusing to be intimidated. Every step was measured. He wasn't rushing. He was reading, waiting for an opening, trusting his instincts the same way he always had on screen and off. Chuck Norris watched him calmly. There was no tension in Chuck's face, no sign of aggression. His breathing was slow, even. He didn't mirror Clint's movements. He adjusted to them, subtly shifting angles, closing distance without appearing to. To the untrained eye, it might have looked passive. To anyone who understood combat, it was something else entirely. It was control. Clint moved first. It wasn't reckless. It wasn't wild. He stepped in fast, confident, throwing a clean, committed strike, the kind meant to test reactions rather than end a fight. For a fraction of a second, it felt like the room leaned forward with him. Chuck reacted without thinking. Not because he was impulsive, but because his body had already learned the answer. His response was instant, precise, and efficient. He redirected the strike, stepped inside Clint's balance, and in one seamless motion shifted the entire dynamic of the encounter. Less than 3 seconds passed. 3 seconds was all it took. Clint felt his footing disappear before his mind could catch up. The world tilted. The mat rushed up beneath him. In one controlled movement, Chuck had him off balance, down, and pinned, not violently, not brutally, but decisively. There was no struggle. No panic. Just the sudden, undeniable awareness that resistance was pointless. Chuck applied just enough pressure to make the truth clear, then stopped. No follow-up. No dominance. No humiliation. He released Clint, stepped back, and straightened up. "That's enough," he said softly. The words weren't a command. They were a courtesy. Clint remained on the mat, staring up at the ceiling, his chest rising and falling as he caught his breath. There was no pain radiating through his body, no injury to explain the stillness. What held him there was something deeper. Realization. For the first time in years, Clint Eastwood wasn't playing the toughest man in the room, and he wasn't trying to be. He had felt the difference between image and reality in a way no script could ever convey. Chuck didn't loom over him. He didn't offer commentary. He simply waited. After a moment, Clint sat up slowly. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaled, and let out a quiet breath that sounded almost like a laugh, not of embarrassment, but of understanding. He looked at Chuck, not with resentment, but with something close to awe. There was no anger in the room. No bitterness. No wounded pride. Only respect. Clint stood, brushing the mat dust from his clothes, his posture different now, lighter, humbler. He met Chuck's eyes and gave a small nod. No words were necessary. Everything that needed to be said had already been answered in those 3 seconds. That moment never made headlines. No rumors leaked to tabloids. No dramatic retellings surfaced in interviews. But it lived on quietly, passed from one industry veteran to another, whispered as a lesson rather than a spectacle. Because in that locked gym, Clint Eastwood didn't lose a fight. He gained something far more rare in Hollywood. Truth. And that truth would change the way he understood strength for the rest of his life. Clint stood up slowly. There was no rush in his movements, no need to prove anything anymore. He brushed himself off, straightened his jacket, and took a moment before speaking. The gym felt different now, quieter, calmer, as if the tension that once filled the space had been drained completely. Then came the moment that shocked everyone who would later hear this story. Clint Eastwood laughed. Not a loud laugh. Not a nervous one. And certainly not a mocking one. It was a genuine open laugh, the kind that comes when a truth lands so clearly that resistance becomes pointless. For a man whose on-screen persona was built on silence and control, the sound carried unexpected weight. He shook his head slightly and looked at Chuck Norris with something rarely seen in Hollywood egos. Respect. You could have broken me, Clint said honestly. But you didn't. There was no bitterness in his voice. No defensiveness. Just recognition. Chuck didn't respond immediately. He stood where he was, hands relaxed at his sides, breathing steady. To him, what had happened wasn't dramatic. It was simply discipline applied correctly. When he finally spoke, his words were calm, almost instructional. Power means knowing when not to use it. The sentence hung in the air, heavier than any punch. That was the shock. Not that Clint Eastwood had been taken down. Not that Chuck Norris had proven his ability. But that two legends stood in a quiet gym, stripped of performance, and chose humility over dominance. Before we continue, backhand index pointing down comment, legends, if you respect humility over ego. Thumbs up like this video if real strength inspires you. Bell subscribe, these stories aren't taught anywhere else. Clint nodded slowly, absorbing the words. This wasn't a loss, it was an education. In one brief exchange, he had learned more about strength than years of playing tough characters had ever taught him. From that day on, Clint Eastwood never questioned Chuck Norris again. Not publicly. Not privately. Not even in jest. Instead, something subtle shifted. Clint's understanding of toughness changed. He began to see power not as intimidation, but as restraint. Not as dominance, but as composure. The silent confidence he would later bring to his roles wasn't sharpened by ego, it was grounded in awareness. Chuck, meanwhile, said nothing about the encounter. He didn't tell friends. He didn't hint at it in interviews. For him, speaking about it would have cheapened the lesson. Real strength didn't need witnesses. Yet Hollywood noticed the change. People who worked closely with Clint sensed a new depth, a quieter authority that felt less performative and more earned. He listened more. He observed more. And when he spoke about toughness, it carried a weight that came from understanding, not assumption. The industry thrived on rivalries, but this was different. There was no feud to exploit, no headlines to spin. What existed between Clint Eastwood and Chuck Norris was something Hollywood rarely produced. Mutual respect. Years later, when asked indirectly about Chuck Norris, Clint never bragged. He never downplayed him either. He spoke carefully, thoughtfully, the way one does when referencing someone who doesn't need defending. The truth was simple. Clint had walked into that gym confident in his image. He walked out confident in his limits. And that knowledge didn't weaken him. It refined him. The shock wasn't the fight. The shock was the humility that followed. Because in a town built on illusion, two men chose honesty, and in doing so, they quietly set a standard few would ever meet. Instead of rivalry, a quiet bond formed. There were no public gestures to mark it. No handshakes photographed, no joint appearances arranged by publicists. In fact, to anyone watching from the outside, nothing seemed to change at all. Clint Eastwood continued making films. Chuck Norris continued training, acting, and living by the same discipline he always had. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. Clint didn't talk about the encounter. He didn't joke about it, didn't retell it for laughs, didn't use it as a story to elevate himself or diminish Chuck. That silence spoke volumes. For a man known for projecting strength through restraint, this became a personal code. Some experiences weren't meant to be shared, only absorbed. What did change was how Clint portrayed toughness on screen. The shift was subtle, but unmistakable to those who paid attention. His characters became quieter. The flashiness faded. The unnecessary aggression disappeared. Instead, there was control, an authority that didn't need to announce itself. When Clint's characters acted, it felt deliberate. When they were silent, it felt powerful. Less show. More certainty. Directors noticed. Actors noticed. Even audiences felt it, though most couldn't quite explain why his presence seemed heavier, more grounded, more real. It wasn't bravado anymore. It was restraint. Chuck Norris, meanwhile, gained something Hollywood rarely gives without a fight: respect. Not the loud, performative kind fueled by publicity, but the kind exchanged quietly between professionals who know the difference between image and ability. He didn't demand better roles. He didn't remind anyone of his titles. He didn't correct misconceptions. He simply showed up prepared, disciplined, and consistent. Word traveled fast in Hollywood, but it traveled differently this time. Not through gossip columns or studio leaks, through trainers, coordinators, and seasoned actors who understood combat. People began to say things like, "If Chuck's involved, it'll be done right," or "That guy doesn't fake anything." His calm became his signature. Years passed. Careers evolved. Trends changed. But the story, never fully told, lingered in industry halls like a half-remembered lesson. Those who heard it didn't repeat it casually. They whispered it with respect, as if the truth might lose its weight if spoken too loudly. Years later, in private conversations with close friends, Clint would occasionally reflect on it. Not dramatically. Not with ego. Just matter of fact. Chuck Norris is the most dangerous calm man I've ever met. He didn't say it with awe. He didn't say it with fear. He said it with certainty. That sentence carried more respect than any public endorsement ever could. No interviews followed. No tell-all stories surfaced. No late-night hosts joked about it. Because both men understood something rare, that real strength doesn't need validation. And real respect doesn't need an audience. In an industry addicted to spectacle, they chose discretion. The bond between them wasn't friendship in the traditional sense. They didn't train together regularly. They didn't collaborate often. But there was an unspoken understanding, a recognition that when two men meet without pretense, something honest is exchanged. Hollywood thrives on mythology. This story survived because it rejected it. No heroes. No villains. Just two men who tested reality and accepted the result. And in doing so, they left behind something more enduring than headlines. A standard. A reminder that toughness isn't loud. That power doesn't posture. And that respect, once earned through truth, never fades. All without a single camera watching. That fight never made the news. No headlines screamed about it. No studio leaked the story for attention. But it made history. Not the kind written in magazines or carved into box office numbers. The kind carried quietly through generations as a lesson. Because what happened in that locked gym wasn't about violence or victory. It was about understanding something most people spend their entire lives avoiding. Real power doesn't need applause. And real confidence doesn't need to prove anything. Clint Eastwood walked into that gym believing toughness was image, a presence, a reputation, a role perfected over years of silence and steel-eyed stares. He had earned his place in Hollywood by convincing the world he was unbreakable. And in many ways, he was. But image is only half the truth. Clint walked out understanding that real toughness is discipline. It's restraint under pressure. It's knowing when to stand firm and when to stand down. It's accepting limits without feeling diminished by them. That lesson didn't weaken him. It sharpened him. It gave his strength weight instead of noise. Chuck Norris walked into that gym a champion. Titles already behind him. Victories already proven. Skills already unquestioned. But he walked out a legend, not because he won, but because he chose control over domination. Because he understood that the highest level of strength is responsibility. Anyone can throw power around. Very few can hold it back. That's the difference between being feared and being respected. Hollywood is built on performance, on illusion, on carefully constructed myths. Yet in that moment, stripped of cameras and crowds, two men confronted something real. One learned the limits of image. The other demonstrated the depth of discipline. And neither needed to say a word about it afterward. That's why this story matters. Not because it involves famous names, but because it reflects a truth that applies far beyond Hollywood. In workplaces, in relationships, in life itself, the loudest person in the room is rarely the strongest. The need to prove power is often a sign of insecurity. True strength is calm. It listens. It waits. It knows when enough is enough. Clint Eastwood didn't lose that day. Chuck Norris didn't need to win. Both walked away richer in something far more valuable than pride. Perspective. Because some battles aren't meant to be won. They're meant to be learned from. Backhand index pointing down comment, respect, if you believe humility is the ultimate strength. Thumbs up like this video to honor true icons. Bell subscribe for more untold Hollywood legends. If this story resonated with you, carry its lesson forward. Stay calm when tested. Stay humble when powerful. And remember, the strongest people don't announce their strength. They live it. Clapperboard fire.